Good afternoon, everyone. Today is August 8th, 2023. It's 1 p.m. This is a City of Prescott study session. Roll call, please.
Mayor Good.
Present.
Mayor Pro Tem Montoya.
Here.
Councilwoman Kentelme.
Here.
Councilman Moore.
Here.
Councilmember Rusing.
Here.
Councilman Sishka.
Here.
And Councilman Tenney.
Yes, ma'am.
All are present.
Thank you, City Clerk. Today we'll be talking about the quarterly update on the Mayor's Commission for Water Policy Review and Monitoring, and we'll also have a presentation and discussion regarding the City of Prescott Code Compliance Program. So we could start off with item 3A.
Thank you, Mayor and Council. And today we're going to have our water resource, and forgive me, I don't know the exact title.
Water Resource Project Manager.
There we go.
You can add a few more words onto the end too. I'm sure it would be fine.
That's right. She's going to give an update on the Water Policy Review and the Monitoring Commission, and prior to us bringing this back to Council for a October or November vote for Council to update the policy.
Ready for me to proceed? You're welcome. Good afternoon, City Manager, Mayor, and Council. Leslie Grazer, Water Resource Project Manager out of Public Works. So this is going to be a very basic quarterly update as requested. The slides will match your memo, so you're not seeing necessarily anything new on the memos except for a map maybe at the end. We're going to go through background, next steps, proposed timelines, and future works. And as I said, it will be fairly quick, because I think this is familiar. So as you recall, your last quarterly presentation was in May, and the last commission meeting was in July. So we had to do a pretty good hustle from that meeting to this meeting, and I hope we've captured the important parts for you. While we were looking at that, we also provided information up the chain all the way to the city manager about maybe the next steps of what this might look like, and wanted to make sure that's where the city wanted to go. So these findings are from last time, so they shouldn't be necessarily familiar or unfamiliar. I'll just touch on a few of them. The 2020 water policy is more effective than the 2019 policy for managing finite water supplies. So the note here, actually I should probably finish a little bit more of that sentence. However, it should remove or correct any language that the city doesn't or can't act upon. So a note on this one is that the 2019 policy and the code changes that happened at that time significantly changed how the city was doing business related to water resource management. So that was pretty straightforward for the committee to the commission to look at this and know there was a distinct change that happened over time. So the 22 policy is more effective. It has its challenges because a lot of the underpinnings were removed by codes and policy changes that were made before it. Next, it's recommended the city begin the process to develop a long-term water management plan. Again, it was interesting through the city's general plan commission. They said, well, why wasn't in 2015? It said you guys were going to make a long-term water management plan. But again, with changes due to the 2019 policy and the code changes that supported that, it didn't have the city looking into they took a pause basically on planning for water resources. So why did this happen? Or why is it more effective? Why do we need a long-term management plan? The commission noticed quite a few disconnects, and we couldn't quite sort through all of them. They needed, I think it was valuable for them to have a year to see that policy in play. It's hard to be critical of something until you let it exercise itself a little bit and look into it a little bit closer. But you'll recall they had 16 of the 22 policies that they were concerned about, as well as other text within it. Here again, it's not a fault of bringing back the 22 policies, it's just that the 22 policy was a recreation of an older policy that we had. And if you had a big disruption in the middle and tried to put that back into effect, you didn't have the pieces behind it to support it anymore. Moving forward, there's a little bit additional language. This isn't its own bullet point. This is it looks like a slide error. So Here again, it just kept coming through as a repeating comment, is that the city needed a long-term water management plan to carry its water health and safety when there are changes from one elected and leadership bodies to another. To the commission's credit, beyond trying to figure out what was going on with changes over time, they were also very forward-looking, and so they wanted to see more in the future that related to sustainability, pumping offsets, rainwater, stormwater, so the green infrastructure you've heard about quite a bit. This policy and this commission wasn't built to go that far. It was slated to slowly look at the 22 policy, but we also reaped quite a few rewards of that group to look into the future for us as well. And the last one, it is recommended the city develop procedures for the water resource management model that aren't currently reflected in the policy. So there's very limited text. After the group looking at it more closely and asking me questions about it, we could see that the worm wasn't fully employed by this policy. So just, again, these are things that should be familiar to you and not necessarily new. So we're just kind of recapping. So next steps, where do we potentially need to go? So to correct the 22 water management policy so that it can act as a bridging document due to the sweeping changes that were made in crafting and employing the 2019 policy, and to incorporate this worm. The proposal on the table is to use it as a bridging document. Spending the time to try to fix all the disconnects doesn't necessarily work because you still can't tie it back to codes that you had 5 years ago that you no longer have anymore in place. So it might not necessarily be the best use of time. So the proposal is to bridge, and the bridge is necessary in part so that the policy aligns with the city's active decision and order of assured water supply that was filed in December 2021. It has some general plan implications. We'll look at a map of that a little bit later. So the main tasks, what does it look like to get to where we need to go and try to do it in 2 months flat? We're going to have to move quick. So we do want to incorporate the policy recommendations that the commission brought forward, noting that there's some language that is either too complicated to fix or it's just not feasible in the time limits to do something that requires you to go all the way back into codes and get code approvals and then get them back so that it can support a policy. We had very distinct and ongoing direction from our legal department, former, not existing, that but I think it still holds true, is that the contract is where, it holds that things very tightly related to water supplies, and then you have your codes that you should be following. And then we were told at one time policies, you can kind of follow those. But you need, if the codes are the ones that help keep things consistent across the community, then you would hope that you would follow those through with your policy and not have your policy try to dictate back to your codes. It's not going to work necessarily. So number 2 there is provide additional limited changes, updates to the policy, but enough to help staff process the applications that fall into pitfalls due to complex contracts. Some of these contracts are like the 1960s to 1999. 1999 was a significant shift because that's when the area was declared out of safe yield. That's when the city went for their first decision in order of assured water supply, and that's where councils were setting forth budgets of how that water would be allocated. And then we have some other nuances along the way too. So it's challenging for staff if you're the frontline person and you want to answer that question quickly, but you don't have the resources you need. So we'd like to take care of that. Update the policy to specifically address the worm, so I probably don't need to go into that more. Address adjustments needed to policies and code to ensure both documents are in alignment. I kind of touched on that one already. Provide definitions and understanding of terms. I've found that in my career all these years is that even though you think you're talking about the same thing, sometimes you're not. And so we need to have that consistency, throughout the city, whether we're talking with an elected official or with a colleague or with the public, that we're using the terminology correctly. expand upon the current budgeting methodology. So you know that currently that it's 25 acre feet for residential, non-residential, then you subtract from there. But we had ongoing questions of what are you subtracting then the 25 from? So we need to look at that and figure out what is the best way to address that in this bridging document again. I'd like to just keep reinforcing this isn't going to be the perfect water policy. You need something to carry you until we get through a couple of these things that the city needs to have in place. So moving on to proposed timelines. This is what we proposed up the leadership chain to potentially meet this this work process and get us to an endpoint that we can feel is successful until we can move to the next step that needs to be done. I'm not going to read all these out, but you can see we're going to put our potentially is what I was told that it's okay to put the commission on a 2-month recess, let staff hammer a lot of things out, bring it back, then bring it to a council study session, followed by November 28th being a possible approval if that document is sufficient to meet the needs, and the council also deems it sufficient as well. Okay, last just a couple slides. So this is a clip from our water resource management model. The more we use these pictures, the better we get it in our communication with each other. At the very top, you can see, of course, that's the Chino Valley area. The yellow is the town of Chino Valley limits. The blue background that we're starting to hit next is the Prescott Active Management Area, a portion of it. You hit the red line boundary, that's our general plan. You can see underneath there's a blue line that's a little bit hard to see, but there's a service area that also extends out to the west in the lower left area there. And of course, I think we've been using these points fairly consistently, so it becomes more and more familiar. But the green is the points. The green points are representing current, meaning somebody's connected to the city and they are being billed for water. They're getting due to the scale of this, the yellow, which is our committed demands, are being crowded out a little bit, but there's plenty of committed. And then the purple points are starting to show where it's projected. So we're once again trying to help the city realign its terminology and understandings back in the 2019 policy timeframe, and a year or so before, there was actions where subtracting the current demand from the portfolio and not really accounting and understanding that we also had committed and projected. So meaning you have obligations in contracts, so you can't assume that you have a huge pool of water left to allocate. What you do have is a lot of supplies and future development that can occur, but at some point you have to know what's committed and projected already and really account for that, and then figure out what do you have left to use into the future. So just to point out the area, it's the blue area just basically south of the red line, which is once again the general plan area as we have it from 2015. This area that just highlighted in a darker purple. So this is not to show the density, but as water resource managers, we look at what is your possibilities, what could be possible out there. Oh, if it's zoned RE2, that could be a lot more homes. But once again, your reality is it can't be all homes. There has to be support services as well. So, your general plan commission is working hard as well, moving towards what this might look like, and the water resources group is going to be, side by side, because we also have to not just partner with the general plan, but really tie in well to our community development folks who know what that boundary is going to look like, what the land potentially might look like, what kind of, percentage of housing versus commercial versus industrial, to maintain a good economic future and health for this community. So that's my last slide for today. If I can answer any questions, I'd be happy to do so.
Mayor Pro Tem.
Thank you, Mayor. Leslie, I appreciate the work that you and the Mayor's Commission has done to kind of knit this together. I know that initially it was a little bit of kind of everyone getting on the same page and understanding things. So it looks like there's, between this presentation and the last presentation you did, where they looked at 16 specific policies that they think we need to tweak around the edges a little bit. I think that's good work. I just wanted to emphasize in your next steps number 6 that you called out, expand upon current budgeting methodology by adding annual evaluation to account for the water being allocated within each water application overall. I'm so glad to see that, because I think that's a source of a lot of confusion for not just people like me, but I think the general public as well. And so if we can get a better understanding of how that interplays, I think that would be really good. And then I'm also just encouraged that we are back on track to move forward with a long-term water management plan, and that's going to get married into a general plan idea as well. I think that will create a lot more clarity about how water works in our community beyond the water policy in a way that makes a lot of sense. So I just wanted to call out those two things and say thank you.
You're welcome.
Councilman Shishka.
Thank you, Mayor. I appreciate that. But I think Ms. Rusing here wanted to speak, and I'll let her speak before I do. Okay. Thank you. Leslie, one of the issues that I had with the 2022 policy was how we treated commercial the same we treated residential. And, we always talk about, we want commercial. I've heard several council people say we want commercial, we want industrial. But usually, particularly commercial, comes after rooftops. And we want to slow rooftops down. And so what I'm wondering is, are we discouraging commercial and somewhat industrial through the limitations we have on budgeting for particularly commercial?
That's a good and long question that we should sit down and have coffee about, but we can't. So, I think the goal is never to, this is so intertwined. So I don't think the intent was ever to limit commercial. You don't want to do that, but you do need to know what supplies you have, and also look at how much more residential you really need. So it's an economic balancing act. And in the years that I was managing water resources, we spoke with our water issues subcommittee. We spoke at the council level in many different venues that we wanted to make sure there was a pool of water available for commercial, so that when those right interconnects happened, the economic development folks or otherwise could move ahead swiftly, because it is a competitive market out there. So in this policy here, whether it be the 22 policy as it exists or the amended, we're not going to solve your question. I apologize. We won't be able to solve that in this step. But in long-term management planning is where you look at all your demands and all your supplies and put in your infrastructure and all your economic, thought processes, and see if you can come up with how you make sure that you're not limiting that aspect of it. And I think also, Councilman Shishka, formerly we had a pool dedicated to commercial. So it was ready-go water, So I haven't seen that. Maybe the 2019 policy slimmed things down too much, and pools that we had formerly identified were kind of mixed into one. And maybe that's where you're seeing maybe some of the challenges that resulted from the 2019 policy.
Well, what I don't want to do is I don't want to discourage people from the standpoint from the get-go who say, well, I can do all the planning for this operation that I want to do, but I might not get water. So, somehow we need to find a happy medium in there to make sure that these folks have some insurance that we're not going to cut them off at the knees when they get to the Water Issues Committee.
I understand. So, in the level that I work at, I won't be making those kind of decisions, but at your city management level and others, Public Works won't be making that decision directly. Those are part of the long-term water management plan, is how you make sure you have water supplies available at the ready for that right projects as they come along.
Thank you.
You're welcome, sir.
Councilmember
Mayor.
Rusing.
Thank you. Leslie, when you're talking about developing a long-term water management plan, you're not talking about a regional water management plan, because we're desperately in need of a regional water management plan. So you want to have just one for the city of Prescott, and then maybe we'll start looking at a regional one? Could you explain that a little more?
Yes, ma'am, Councilperson Roosing. It is good to have your house in order before you start reaching out too far. So I've mentioned this to previous councils and mayors and staff, people that I've worked with over the years, is that, you can hope that your neighbor helps put out a fire at your house or notify you, but you really should make sure your house is fire safe first. And so I think that's where it needs to start. And then what you do have benefit-wise from a regional standpoint is that you are in an active management area. So there are some basic standards that all of us have to work towards. But when we start doing interconnects or serving more water into areas outside of our incorporated area, that's a big discussion. It's not a quick one by any means.
Okay, and then I have another question. The previous water policy of 2019 was very pro-growth, very pro-developer friendly, and this new one of 2022 actually makes an effort to manage our water. And so I'm kind of concerned, what are you talking about, a bridge between the two of them? Because it seems to me like that's a contradiction.
No, not a bridge between the two. I think it's a bridge from our 2022, to where we need to be in the future. And our future parts haven't really fallen into place, but I can see that there's challenges for the city when they haven't aligned what's been submitted through their decision order of assured water supply and what they say in their policy and other pieces. So thank you for that. I think that's really important to clarify. We're not trying to put any bridge between the 2019.
Okay,
We know how
thank
that
you.
stands. We know how the 22 stands. We know the 22 was a resuscitation of an older policy. But we can also see that resuscitating the older policy when you don't have any of the underpinnings in place anymore can't do as much as it really wants to. The bottom line, though, was it a good choice to move towards a 22 water management policy and try to bring back some of the things that this community has used for many years? Yeah, it was probably a really good decision because it helps see the differences, but we also know that you just don't stop. You're always having to work forward. In my work, our planning horizons are much more than 5 years, much more than 10 years. We're looking much further out. But we also understand the reality of you have to move questions, concerns, needs now.
Okay, thank you, Leslie.
Yes, ma'am.
City Manager.
Thank you, Mayor. I just wanted to point out, as Leslie's been talking about, and some of what maybe address a little bit of what Councilmember Shishka has mentioned. When you look at that big purple area that's out there and where people might want to be coming in the future potentially, or how we're going to deal with commercial and things like that, a couple of things just to keep in mind. Our general plan obviously is a very important planning document that can help us identify some of that. That's Leslie's point, is that some of this needs to be integrated into some of our general plan language and goals related to that. But then also we'll be bringing forward, obviously, in over the next 6 months or so, we're looking to bring in a economic development strategic plan. And that's where I think your question related to commercial, because then we'll have the ability to really understand what are those things that we are trying to attract, what are those things that we want to have. That will help inform the overall water planning and the model that they're looking to use. So that will help inform that. And then we'll have a better sense, I think, about what it is then is available, what the demands are, what the supplies are, how we want to use those on a longer term basis. And that's what I think the future longer term one could address some of that as well. The longer term water management policy could address that.
Mayor Pro Tem.
Thank you, Mayor. I think the city manager just hit the nail on the head for me with what I was going to say, which is that to me, it's one thing to say we don't want to cut commercial development off at the knees, but if we don't have a plan for where we're going, we're never going to get anywhere really. And so I think the idea of knitting together the economic development plan that you're talking about, city manager, the long-term water management plan, and using the general plan as a kind of a framework to tie those things together is really powerful, so that when we have commercial development that comes to our community, we can say, yep, you are someone we want to encourage to do business here, and it's really clear that this drives to what the priorities we've identified as a community, as opposed to just being reactionary and having to kind of say, well, does this make sense, and where is this the right location, or having a really defined outline of where we want to go as a community. And it's one of the reasons I'm really excited that we have a lot of really good people working on both the Mayor's Commission for this water policy and the General Plan Committee, and really excellent staff members who are helping guide both those processes. So I think we're in a good place, and I love that we're working on that on an economic development level too. Thank you, City Manager.
Councilwoman Cantelmi.
Thank you, Mayor. Sorry about that. Leslie, I wanted to ask you, with the data that we do have through the WORM, isn't it possible even today, once we establish these, the acre feet that we would be allowing into, and I'm talking about a commercial entity that would decide to come here, we can control with the size of those commercial developments that want to come here based on this water policy. And usually the normal route is somebody would come here, like let's say a Walmart, and through this new program we have, we should be able to know, not only through the Walmart that's here now, but through the models of what a business that size would generate in water usage. So wouldn't that be a form of limiting who even looks here? And wouldn't that be something that a commercial company that would be interested in coming here to Prescott should have, at their fingertips right away before they make all these big plans, and then all of a sudden they come to us and they realize later that they can't get the water. So if we by establishing the water usage through data, it's informed data, we should be able to limit at that time. So do you foresee a time where this water policy would begin to limit who comes here and who we allow to come here based on the water usage?
This bridging document, no, I don't think so. In the future, the city will have to make decisions. If you've allocated, all of your water and you haven't brought in new supplies, then you have what you have. Or if there's not switches in the community where they get even more water efficient with their use. So I think to your point, that's exactly what our concern has been, is the water resource management model was kind of put on a hold. The water resource management model was solely the first step to have all of our data in order so we could use it for future planning and for applying to the Department of Water Resources to make sure we had our legal document updated as it needed to be. But with the 2019 policy and activities at that time putting us kind of on a hiatus for a while, we're a little bit behind. So those things of running scenarios and actually exercising that model hadn't been done. So we would like to do that to make sure that whatever that future configuration is, we still have that level of safety that we can say, yeah, if we have a supply type dropout, because it's not just about demands, it's on your supply side too. What happens if your supplies change on you for some reason? Then you can't say you have all this water anymore and we can do X, Y, and Z. You might have a situation where you're like, we've had a supply side issue. So we'd like to integrate, is a word that I've used over many, many years, all these different pieces, whether it be an economic development plan, the infrastructure, good practices in water resource management to carry you through some of those ups and downs that all communities have related to water.
Do you foresee if, hypothetically, let's say, well, the trend right now nationally is a mixed use product anyway. Yeah. But do you foresee a time if I'm a commercial builder, owner, wanted to come to Prescott and I decided to have a mixed use facility, would you be able to pull up that data based on what we know now to make a theoretical decision on how much water I would theoretically need to be able to progress forward into the development?
That's what I think would be beneficial for the city to have, so they can be more responsive to an applicant, know where they stand, not have to kind of wonder, and offsets. There might be something that slows down while something else is picking up, and that's the part of it that we talked about. And I don't think you really had the opportunity as this council is sitting now, or maybe some previous councils, to really start looking at that with us and seeing the slider bars. What you saw mostly was it's 0.17 for this and 0.12 for this, and off we go. But for your question, and Councilman Shishka's as well, there's been quite, things have been moving along on the commercial side. Those, if you just take support services, those seem to just move on through and be fine. What we want to be watching for is something that's going to be way outside, what we expected. And that's what we were seeing with this policy as it is now, and the previous one would have allowed it too, is there were no cross checks. So if something moved through that was going to be 500 apartment complexes and our water resource model didn't account for that, we hadn't accounted for that in our application to the state to make sure we have our legal document order, those are the things we need to be protecting the city from. Not necessarily, it's not a limiting of somebody, it's recognizing where you're at, and what you can do.
Well, I think it's obvious to me that we need many categories. We need residential, we need commercial, we need mixed use, we need industrial. I mean, we need to be able to start to collect all of those numbers broken down and not one blanket allotment.
Well,
But thank you.
In budgeting, yes, ma'am. But to your point, we are broken down that way, and that's how the model is built too. We know from our billing standpoint, good range of categories: single-family resident, or single-family, multifamily, commercial, industrial, turf. We have all those things because those are part of your requirements for reporting to the state as well. So here again, I think that one of the key words is integration and good planning. We want to be back on a path that we're planning. If as long as you stay between a couple bars, you can ride out those things. But if you aren't even thinking ahead, you run into challenges and maybe losing commercial that you do want because you're not prepared to address and work with them.
Thank you, Leslie.
Yes, ma'am.
Councilmember Rusing.
Thank you. If I was a business coming to Prescott to invest, I would be happy to know that the city has a water management policy to protect our future water supplies versus a community that didn't have anything at all. Because I don't know if you're aware, down in Phoenix, I don't know if you've heard of the expression toilet to tap. There's communities in Phoenix that are already proceeding with plans to build infrastructure so that the drinking water down there will be blended with treated effluent. So hopefully, that has a pretty big ick factor to me. I guess it can be done, but hopefully that's something that here in Prescott, if we manage our finite water resources wisely, we won't be coming to that point in the future. Thank you.
Mayor Pro Tem, you're back up.
Thank you, Mayor. I'll be real quick. I just had a question, Leslie, and you might not know this, so maybe Brian or Gwen can answer this, but there's some suggestion that there's a stymieing of commercial activity that's happened through the current water policy. We're a little over 2 months into the current water budget cycle. How much commercial has been used so far in this budgeting cycle?
Brian Reese with the City of Prescott Public Works. Mayor Pro Tem, I don't believe we've had any used in the commercial cycle at this point.
Yeah, I knew the answer to that question. I was kind of making a point, but thank you, Brian.
Is this a true question?
It was.
Just
I knew the answer to the
Water
question.
Issues
I was
Subcommittee.
being a little bit, but it just I think to some of the point that that Councilperson Rusing has made, this is a reasonable check on development. And I think, again, going back to what I heard the city manager say, I'm really encouraged by the idea that we have a comprehensive plan of what type of commercial this community wants and what that looks like and how that knits into the fabric of our community. And it seems like if we were bursting at the seams and having a queue of commercial development that was not able to come forward in this community, I would have different feelings about this water budget policy, but I haven't seen that happen since we implemented this policy on either really the residential or the commercial side. And the one time it happened on the residential side, we heard an appeal on it, and that project was able to move forward. So just wanted to throw that out there.
Yeah, I do want to say that when we decided to implement this new policy, it was a combination of looking at the previous policy and even the policy that preceded the 2019 policy. And we're trying to balance really both residential and non-residential allocations and development, but in a pace that allows us to keep up with the demands for traffic, infrastructure, and particularly public safety. So that was the intention of that policy, and we knew when we adopted it that it had not been fully vetted and analyzed. But rather than go through an analysis paralysis process, we felt it was important to get the bulk of that incorporated and start to be used. And with that, this commission to be able to analyze how it was working, make recommendations to make it better, and really focus on refining it as best as possible. Because I think as you've presented, there are so many different components to this. Not only is the 25-25 the right number, should it be 30-30? Could it be 25-35? All of those questions needed to be analyzed and determined. We don't want to be overly restrictive and cut off all development, but at the same time, we don't want to be so unregulated that we lose control of our status as an assured water supplier and our portfolio itself. You know, how do we account for our portfolio? How do we reduce granted projects away from the amount of acre feet that we are allowed to manage? Is the allocation fungible? Can we take acre feet from one category, move it into the other if it's appropriate? How do we use the worm the most effectively? Originally, it was a look-back, retrospective management tool where we would allocate acre feet to a project, and then we would look at it 5 years later. Quite frankly, I think it's a much more valuable tool to look at it as an ongoing basis, so that if someone comes in and says, I need 6 acre feet to run my business, and they're allocated that, but we don't look at it for 5 years, they could be using substantially more between the time that they're granted that allocation and the time that we actually start to say, hey, oh, by the way, you're using 3 times as much as you were granted. And then if they do that, what do? Do we apply some type of a regulator on their use of that water? Is there a penalty to go along with it? There's just so many different aspects to a good policy that could be managed both now and in the long run, and that was the original intention of this commission to analyze. And as they are bringing forward some of these recommendations, I think we've answered some of those questions, but there are going to be many more as we continue to refine this, especially bringing it into memorializing it into code, so it'll be ongoing, and we don't have to worry about who gets reelected or doesn't get reelected, and all the work that goes into it is unwound sometime into the future. All those questions, I think, need to be asked and answered so that we have the confidence in the community that we're going to have long-term ability to manage our water resources, and even the non-residential and commercial developments can also have the confidence that in the long run they're going to continue to have access to the water they need to do their operate their businesses. So it's not a quick solution, and after we've made our policy pretty darn effective, then we can start asking questions like, what is the long-term water management plan that we want to be able to incorporate, knowing that we have a solid policy within the city? Maybe after that we can say, how can we use the information that we've pulled together and designed to recommend a regional long-term water management plan with our other neighbors. But I think we need to get our house in order first, and then we can do additional work. I think it's up to the general plan to look at how our policy exists rather than wait to have our policy aligned with whatever the general plan decides to incorporate in their recommendation to the voters. So I think it's important that we continue to work on this and make sure that we have as an effective local plan as we can, and then provide that to the general plan committee so that they can incorporate this policy into their 10-year plan going forward. So it's not an easy job, and I think watching the members of this committee deliberate those things, it's pretty clear that it does take a long time to understand how best to refine this and make it as effective as we can. So those are just a couple of short comments that I had to make. Do we have any other questions or concerns? Do we have any public comment?
We do not, Mayor.
Very well. Well, thank you very much, Leslie, for your ongoing efforts here, and I'm optimistic that we'll end up with a real policy that's going to allow us to manage our future very effectively. So we'll move on to the next item on our study session. City Clerk, do you want to read the description of that?
I'll jump in on this real quick. So the next item is a discussion on our code compliance and building compliance related to a number of conversations I've had with various council members, and some concerns and some interest in looking at our code compliance policies and our code compliance practices. So I'm bringing this forward really more as an opportunity right now for council to kind of weigh in and provide some feedback. I've asked staff to present generally kind of how do we approach our code compliance in the city currently? What are some opportunities? What are some challenges we might have? And really hear a discussion from council about your thoughts about anything more you'd like to see, anything less you'd like to see. So this is really truly a policy discussion about how code compliance can look, should look, or you would like it to look kind of on a go-forward basis. So I've asked, I think Chelsea's here, she's going to present, but I think we also have Ryan and George is going to be doing some as well. So we'll let them get started.
Thank you, City Manager, Mayor, council members. Thanks for this opportunity for the team to present on the topic of code compliance, which includes both neighborhood services code compliance, which George is going to speak to, and building code compliance, which is a more building safety related item, which Ryan, our chief building official, will speak to. Our intent, as Katie had mentioned, is just to provide you with an overview of what we do, how we've been performing these processes and procedures to date, and again, to receive that policy feedback and direction from you. This is a great opportunity and a conversation we haven't had, so we're excited to be able to present to you and hear your feedback. Our intent is to present the processes in general terms, not enforcement actions in particular. So although you may hear us provide cases anecdotally, we won't state any addresses, and we're going to shy away from going into any particular cases, but we're happy to provide the council feedback in a separate way if you have any particular concerns or questions on specific addresses. So with that, I'd like to invite Mr. Worley up.
We need taller microphones. Mayor and Council, good afternoon. We're going to walk through a number of steps of what we already have in place. Also talk a little bit about challenges and opportunities that we've identified. You're welcome to give us input during the process. Feel free to jump in with questions or comments along the way. I will tell you this is fairly comprehensive, so we may answer your questions in future slides. If you want to wait for that and ask questions at the end, you're welcome to do that as well. Oops, one time too many. So we're going to talk a little bit about code compliance overall. This will be more of just a look at how we are organized. The authority that we have that's established by city code that is limited to certain types of topics, and we'll talk about those topics. Compliance processes. These are important to give you an idea of how long it takes from the time a code case is initiated to the time that it lands in front of someone who can adjudicate it if that's necessary. I have some statistics that may give you a little bit of an idea of the types of codes we deal with and the types of complaints that we deal with. The adjudication options, things have changed recently. Council action late last year gave us an opportunity to create a second process rather than what we were following through prior, so I'll talk about both of those. And then, of course, we always have opportunities and challenges. We want to take advantage of any of those to improve the processes that we have. Just a quick organizational point, neighborhood services, which is one of the terms we use for our code compliance division, is part of community development. You can see there are 4 separate sections of community development, historic preservation and planning and zoning being those that will not be talked about today. We have 2 compliance officers. They are both here. Tander Hill and Wendy Starr are our code compliance officers. They're fidgeting in the front row because they're used to being out in the field and not sitting in a council meeting. So thank you for being here. One of the things that we're often asked is, what's the purpose of code enforcement, code compliance, code whatever you want to call it. Generally, we call it code compliance because that's what we're trying to gain. So we focus on trying to gain that compliance through voluntarily, through education, through helping people along the way, and sometimes by providing resources to people who don't have the resources to bring their property into compliance. What kinds of codes do we handle? Primarily, the section I'm going to talk about are neighborhood services related codes. These are based on City Code Chapter 7.5. Chapter 7.5 deals with private property maintenance. So we're looking at things that are not in public rights of way or on public property. It's on private property. And it's something that's generally visible to other property owners in the vicinity. We look at those things from the perspective of authority that are listed out in 7.5.4, exterior premises. So this is boring language straight out of the code. I won't read it to you, but I will point out 2 areas where I think it's important to understand the situation that we deal with. Item C, weeds, brushes, and trees. We have a lot of overgrowth of brushes apparently in town. And the item G, sidewalks, maintenance of free of debris. Sidewalks are an unusual circumstance. Our city code places the responsibility for sidewalk maintenance on the adjacent private property owner, and therefore we have jurisdiction over it because we have a private property maintenance requirement. We have a few other things that we're also responsible for. We handle the inspection prior to license and registration of vacation rentals. We have approximately 150 in process right now. We deal with parking of recreational vehicles. One of the complaint categories we get is relating to people parking RVs generally in front of their property, and that's something that's an issue. Again, sidewalks. We also deal with signs in the right-of-way. We're responsible, because of the signs in the right-of-way responsibilities, for political signage. Some of you may have been contacted by me recently about political signs in the right-of-way with just some guidance on those placements. One thing not listed up here that we do regularly are, at least twice a year, we have what are called neighborhood cleanups. These are coordinated efforts in a specific geographic area where we work with our solid waste department to provide for effectively a curbside pickup. But we send notices out to all the property owners. We give them an opportunity to pick a location, and we set these up for a pickup on a particular day. Yes,
Mayor Pro Tem, you had a question.
I did. Thank you, Mayor. George, I specifically interested in this. I was actually talking to city manager about this morning. My question is, how do you determine what neighborhoods to go into? Is there a process for that? And can you expand on that a little bit?
it's a little bit subjective. So one of the things we do is sit down, the code division sits down and talks about areas where we have a lot of complaints or we have identified a lot of violations of code. And rather than work on them one at a time, we will pick a geographic area that's reasonable for solid waste to handle in a single day pickup, and then we focus on that area. So it is somewhat subjective, but it's based upon the number of complaints we have.
And I guess the reason I'm asking that is it one of the things that the city manager and I were talking about this morning is the idea of having, and this is something I've talked to the city manager about. I talked to Tyler when he was the interim city manager about, but the idea of incorporating into our communities and our neighborhoods kind of more specifically to identify opportunities like this where we can go out and get in front of these folks and talk to them about, maybe CIP stuff that's happening, capital improvement project. Sorry, I'm trying to avoid acronyms. I know you don't like that. That we're working on to, something that's going to affect their neighborhood in the short term. Let's say maybe a road project or, a sewer project or something like that, and communicating with these folks. But then maybe also kind of extending a hand where, the city manager was talking about, and I shouldn't put words in your mouth. You can jump in whenever you want, Katie. But the idea of, I know other communities do things where they might partner with like a local company that has access to, tools, and they might lend those out to the community so that folks who maybe are disadvantaged might be able to say, hey, I see my neighbor over there. He's cutting down a tree limb because they've got the big roll-off dumpster. I think there's opportunity, and I'm not saying that you guys don't do a great job already, but I think where we can build on that opportunity, it might be interesting to look at those opportunities and perhaps, be, instead of it being a reactive approach where, oh my gosh, a bunch of people are complaining here, seek out maybe members of our community who would be excited about the opportunity. Just a thought.
It's a good thought. We're not entirely reactive because sometimes we will use areas where we know we see a lot of complaints. Many of the things you've talked about have been done in the past here. Unfortunately, code enforcement sort of bounced around between various departments over the last 10 years. We have had in the past a good relationship with neighborhood church groups, for instance, who can come out and actually help a particular area or have a focus on a particular area. We had a tool trailer at one time with tools that we would lend out. You came in and you signed out the weed whacker and went out and cleaned up property in your neighborhood. Those things are opportunities that we want to pursue. So all very good ideas, and we appreciate that. That's encouragement for us to keep going down that path. We have talked about increasing the number of neighborhood cleanups as well. So we may be able to increase that number. Part of the problem we have will come to light in future slides when we talk about our challenges. Just to walk through some of the processes that we have, give you an idea of what we do. Typically, we have two different types of enforcement processes. One is a reactive process. Someone calls us, someone writes to us and says, I have a problem in my neighborhood. My neighbor has a junk car. My property homeowners association refuses to clean out the common area. Things like this will trigger us to go out in the field and verify whether it's an actual complaint. So that takes a trip by our code officers to see if there is a violation. It's an extra 2 steps in a process that I'll talk about in a minute. It also leads us to look at other properties in the area of a complaint. That often generates additional code complaints created by the code officers. Depending on circumstances, if we go to a location and 4 neighbors have overgrown vegetation and only one of them got a complaint called against them, all 4 will get the kind and gentle touch from code enforcement to update the circumstances of their property. When we're out in the field, whether it's a trip between an office and a location where we have a complaint, or if while we're on site of a complaint we can see other issues that are violations, as a matter of fairness, so that we're not picking on one person and wearing blinders, we will initiate code complaints on our own. So the officer can identify in the field, and I apologize, you're going to hear inspector and officer both. Either or both are common terminology for code compliance officers/inspectors, they will be able to identify if a violation occurs. They're very well trained. They're very familiar with our codes, and it's unusual for them to have to do a lot of research to figure out whether something is in compliance or not in compliance. So they can initiate a complaint from the field. We have the best technology that's currently available for code enforcement electronically. They carry a tablet. They will initiate a code case. They can photograph it to document it, and it's all done in the field with a single device and then linked up to our computer tracking system back at City Hall, wherever that actually exists right now. I'm not sure where the computer
Councilmember
servers
Rusing,
are.
you had a question?
Oh, thank you. George, under the first box there, complaint received, do we have a method where a neighbor can, like, is there an email address? Is there something on our website? Is there a phone number where something where they can text a picture of what the problem is?
We do. The website has a complaint form that you can fill out. It is a link on the main page of our city website. We also have phone numbers for contact on there. Those phone numbers ring to a common number that either of our officers can answer. And the email addresses are available in the list of city employees. Property owners who have a concern or complaint in their neighborhood can contact us that way as well. So 3 different methods very easily. We also will speak to people if they come into City Hall and have want to have a face-to-face discussion. So multiple ways to address us.
Okay, thank you.
Mayor Pro Tem.
Thank you, Mayor. George, I had a question. When someone initiates a complaint about their neighbor or a property of any sort, I guess, what is the process? What does our process look like for following up with that person? I mean, I imagine initially we say, yep, we got your inquiry, we're aware of it. But then how do we kind of come back to them and say, yep, we're in the process, this is what it looks like? And I guess, again, I imagine, looking ahead, I've looked at the slides, and so I think maybe I imagine a potential frustration that someone might have is that, gosh, I notified the city about this and so many days have gone by, and it feels like maybe in their mind they're thinking, I noticed this 2 months ago. Right. I told the city 2 weeks ago. This has been going on for 3 months. It hasn't been fixed yet. What does that timeline look like? And then is there like a communication back to the person initiating the complaint that happens?
So with the initial communication, we will establish whether they want to be anonymous, whether they want to provide us contact information. If they provide us contact information, we will update them periodically on the processes. As you'll see as we walk through this, processes can be rather long. You'll notice on here that once we send a notice to a property owner that they have a violation, generally by code they're given 30 days to comply. If they're making progress, they're given additional time, often another 30 days, as long as they're complying with the process, as long as they're complying with the process. If a property owner calls and says, I have a complaint, I want to be anonymous, then they won't get contact back. If they say, here's my phone number, you can call me back and let me know. Or if they complain to us via email, we can contact them back and let them know what the status is. So there are ways for them to do that. If you just submit a complaint and don't follow through by contacting us and ask for an update, we will periodically update you on it depending on the circumstances of that particular complaint. So yes, we do follow up with them if they provide us a way to do so.
Thank you.
Back to the reactive complaint process, we've shortened it a little bit because we've identified a complaint. We don't have to go out and verify that it's there. We're already out there and we've already verified it. The rest of the process is the same, whether the complaint's generated by the officer or by a resident in an area. So we follow through the same steps, regardless of which way the process was initiated. Just to give you an idea of, and this is just a one-year time slice, an idea of a workload indicator, for instance. So we get, in this case, we got 466 complaints received within this time frame. we send our officers out in the field. They look at the locations. They determine that of those 466, only 244 are actual violations of code. The others are perceived problems from the neighbors, but they may not hit particular triggers in our code. So a lot of our time is spent verifying whether or not a code violation has occurred. That is a workload indicator that is part of our challenges that we have to deal with. We spend a lot of time verifying that it's not a violation.
Councilman Tenney.
Thank you, Mayor. George, can you give us 2 or 3 examples of some common? I'm struck by the difference between the number of complaints received versus actual cases open. Terrific. You're the experts. Can you give me 2 or 3 common things that come in that are not typically found to be actual violations?
So a couple of things that we will talk about a little bit later are the variations of different types of complaints that we deal with. Weeds is probably the most common. Having grass 6 inches tall in your yard is not having a weed violation. Your neighbor who keeps his grass at 4 inches tall may believe it's a weed violation, and they contact us, and we go out and look at the situation. So we go out in the field and we determine that you have another 8 inches of weed growth before we can come out and tag you. And that's by far actually the most common complaint that we get and the most common reason for the disparity in numbers.
Perfect. Thank you.
A few more statistics just to give you an idea. There's a constant fluctuation of code complaints depending on circumstances. Sometimes it's depending on older neighborhoods maybe deteriorating a little bit. Sometimes it's a matter of newer neighborhoods coming online, and we now have more people who may have interest. As you can see, it's roughly in the same range, but not necessarily the same. You'll also notice that the cases open and cases closed are different. We do most of our tracking by fiscal year. So a case opened in one fiscal year and closed in another skews it a little bit, and we re-round it a little. The last category of final notices is an interesting one. We work with people all the way through the process as much as we can to get them into compliance, but at some point we reach a determination they're not cooperating. And now we're going to turn it over to an adjudication process. And this is where I'll talk in a few minutes about the difference between the two processes, the one we used to have to deal with and the one that we may have future opportunities with. At a final notice, someone is being told, I'm going to turn you over to the legal department and they're going to sue you. That's what the situation means right now. That is a relatively low number. We almost always get compliance along the way, and I have another slide to show you just about timeframes of that. But in those cases where someone absolutely just doesn't want to cooperate with us, that's the process we follow. Again, just to talk about the types of vegetation complaints and the types of junk complaints and the types of RV complaints, you can see that by all accounts, vegetation is the biggest thing. It's primarily weeds. It is periodic. It happens at late spring. It happens during the monsoon, at the end of monsoon, and then it slacks off a little bit for winter, but not entirely, because anything that's left over when the grass turns brown is now considered possibly considered a fire hazard, and we get a lot of complaints again. So we get a big surge in the spring. We have a period in the middle where it's just kind of average busy, and then we get another surge at the end of summer. But again, vegetation is the primary complaint that we receive. Typically, our times for compliance are somewhat predictable. We give someone 30 days, and then we go back and we verify whether or not they've complied with the process or that they're making progress on the process. Some of the folks that we deal with may be financially challenged to complete some of the required processes. So 30 days, then we visit again, we give them another 30 days notice. Nearly all of our complaints are resolved within 60 days, with about 20% in the first 30 and about 40% in the remainder of that time within the full 60 days. Rarely do we extend things out longer. 90 days, again, about 20% of cases, they only get extended if they're making progress, and it's something substantial. So it's got to be some unusual circumstances in order to get us to extend those times. Our current process is citation through city court. This is something that is a time burden and workload burden on the legal department. For us to take someone to court to enforce a code where they're not cooperating with us, we submit the paperwork to the legal department. The legal department has to go through a court process in order to bring this person in front of a judge. Last December, council amended the city code to allow for a hearing officer process that was created in the same section. That has most of us who are involved in code compliance very happy. We're thrilled about the fact that there's an alternative process. And I'll talk to you about that alternative process and why it's so good in just a moment. If we go through the city court process, this is what we've been doing for the last 10 years. We have to work with the legal department, which places a burden on them. They're busy with other things, and we're going to them over an overgrown patch of weeds. It is a priority issue at some point as well. We're subject to the availability of court, so we have to get on their schedule to get someone in front of them. And that time control is all outside of that time frame is all outside of our control. We can't say, I'm going to sue you and take you to court in 1 month. We have no idea. It could be 6 months. It could be a year to get in front of court. It depends on the court being able to schedule it, and it depends on the processes involved in getting it in front of a judge. And then we have a prior history of judges granting additional time when we get someone to them. So they've already gone through a much longer than normal process, and then in court, they're given additional time. The types of complaints we bring forward are often very low priority for the judge. If you just think about the types of things that a judge has to deal with when we bring them a weed complaint or a car with an expired license plate, not going to be a high priority. The new hearing officer process, the legal department, the city legal department is in process of working up a job description, and we're going to go out and fill that position as soon as possible. The city code gives the filling of the position responsibility to community development, so that will be handled by us, by ComDev. Once that position is filled, we will be able to establish a procedure and timeframes where we give a 30-day notice. We may give them a 30-day extension, and then if we don't think they're cooperating, we can say, you're going to go to a hearing officer in 30 days. We can give them a specific day for a hearing at that point in time. That has coercion is one word for it. It has a coercive effect on someone who's being reluctant. We also have control of the time frame. So if we need to shorten the process a bit, we can try and shorten the process.
Mayor Pro Tem.
Thank you, Mayor. George, I have a question about these two processes. Is it the intention that the court process will be abandoned once we have a hearing officer in place, or will there be unusual circumstances perhaps where we'll need to still stay within the system of the court?
We will retain both processes. State law allows that flexibility, and we want to have that flexibility in place. It doesn't preclude us from going through both processes with someone if there's a particular reason to do so. So someone who's being held in front of a hearing officer on account of a code violation or failure to comply with a code violation could also be sued by the city as a secondary means of enforcement. You want to?
Yeah, and if I might add, generally speaking, the hearing officer is a more efficient, better procedure. And that's where almost basically every case should start. But sometimes when there's no compliance after the hearing officer process, there's basically no alternative but go to the court after that. And then we already have established liability and so forth.
That's my question, I guess, too, is if someone goes through the hearing officer process, in theory, and I don't know if this is the right word to use, but if it's adjudicated by that hearing officer, essentially, then does it have more teeth when it goes before the court at that point? Does a judge look at that different than if you're starting from square one with the court process?
The judge would look at it differently. Yeah, it's been an adjudicated issue. There's been a decision on it, and then it would go to court for enforcement. But generally speaking, we could get it done through the hearing officer. But there is that enforcement teeth if we couldn't get it done through the hearing officer.
So, and I imagine it sounds like from what Joe's saying, George, that you guys contemplate that the vast majority of your code compliance complaints are going to at least originate in the hearing officer setting.
That is correct. That will give us much better time frame and more efficiency in the process.
I heard you also say that you have posted this job. Do you have an expectation, or is there an expectation of when we'll actually have a hearing officer at some point in the future?
I don't believe we've posted it yet, but when we do, typically we post for a 2-week period, and we will interview people.
Yep, and I'll say that this was approved. The hearing officer process or ordinance was approved, but the actual hearing officer position wasn't approved until this budget was approved. So we're getting that sent out, and community development will handle hiring that.
Thank you.
Again, we're very happy with this process. This is one of the opportunities in the future to improve our efficiency. So we want to talk a little bit about opportunities, and we've broken them down into short-term and long-term opportunities because some of them will happen relatively quickly. The hearing officer process, again, as the city attorney pointed out, approved in the 24 budget, we're on a relative fast track to get that filled, and we will hopefully have that in place by next few months, maybe early fall. We will be able to have a hearing officer on board and be able to start taking cases to them. We do have to work out a procedure. We have to work with the legal department to make sure that we're following all of state law. The state law allows for hearing officers and subjects them to generally the hearing processes of a traffic court. So we have a model to follow in order to create our processes, but we have flexibility in that, and we'll take advantage of that to make it efficient. We are starting more proactive inspections of our major thoroughfares, looking for code compliance issues that are readily and obviously visible to the public. We rely on tourism in this town. We understand it. Having our main thoroughfares, entryways as clean as possible is something that we take seriously, and we've started an inspection process where we'll be canvassing all of our major thoroughfares regularly. That opportunity, again, also includes perhaps under the short-term opportunities more of the neighborhood cleanups and or outreach as suggested by the city manager for some kind of neighborhood-focused events that we can get people involved in and maybe develop some neighborhood and place pride that they might not have right now because of the conditions in our neighborhood, or simply because it's an older neighborhood and people just don't know each other. So we have opportunities to work there as well that I neglected to put on the short-term slide. Longer-term opportunities, we've talked about using CDBG funding multiple times. We've done it in the past, a couple of projects in the past where we added CDBG monies to a public works project that was within an area that qualified as an eligible area. You can be eligible for CDBG funding either individually or in an area based on general income in that area. So we've worked with that process in the past, but it's been a while. We've spent most of our CDBG monies on service providers in the area. There is a need to help fund those service providers to give them a leg up on certain circumstances, but we have the opportunity to expand CDBG funding out to larger projects. We don't get a lot of CDBG money. Our annual allocation is roughly $233,000 a year. There are some limitations on CDBG, which I'll talk about in a minute or two. And by the way, I introduced code enforcement officers early. I do want to introduce Michael McGinnis, our CDBG coordinator. He is here as well to help answer questions if I stumble. With CDBG money, there are still limitations. There's still strings attached. All federal dollars, tax dollars that we get back into the community come back with strings. Much of the CDBG funding is limited to areas that have been identified as serving low to moderate income persons. We'll talk about that a little bit more in just a moment. So we have some limitations on where we spend the money and how much we can spend on those areas. Public outreach and education is something that we do pretty regularly. We send out notices in the spring about weeds, and we send out notices in the fall and winter about sidewalk maintenance, but there's an opportunity to send out far more notices, far more outreach, maybe programs that will attract attention. We can put our code enforcement officers on the radio. They both have faces for radio like I do. One of the opportunities that we haven't done is really try to use social media to get out more. We do post notices and we do send things out, but there are more opportunities, and we want to pursue those opportunities. And then we may, because of the public outreach process, need some additional resources in order to be able to accomplish those things.
Mayor Pro Tem.
Thank you, Mayor. George, it occurs to me what you're talking about with the public outreach is, it costs staff time, but it's something that is probably could really turn the dial in a positive direction in my mind. And I think of kind of the number one thing you talked about in terms of what we receive the most complaints on, vegetation, and providing education to those folks in the community about. Do you think, maybe something as simple as a social media post is like identify which one is actually the code violation? Because I think there are folks who are clearly perceiving a code violation where there is no code violation necessarily, or it's not yet risen to the level that violates our actual code. But I've been doing more public outreach, and I'm happy to assist in that in any way that I'm capable.
I appreciate that. Thank you.
To kind of bring that message to more people in the community. So
I think it does something. I think it does something that we probably haven't looked at from the perspective of time management. But a code compliance officer can spend 8 hours preparing some kind of publication or social media outreach process, or they can spend 8 hours driving from one property to another in town. You can save a lot of time in the field by making these outreaches meaningful to the people who get them.
Yeah, and I would say I think you have 7 capable people who could go out and make PSAs about that stuff if you guys give us the appropriate script or the ability to talk about it in a way where we don't sound like we don't know what we're talking about, which sometimes we put our foots in our mouth up here. So, but anything you can, you have, I think, people up here who can carry that message and kind of create broader community education around these things. I think that would be a great opportunity.
Excellent. Thank you. Some of our challenges are based on geography. Even I was somewhat shocked by the number. I remember a time when there were about 15,000 buildings. We did a survey of property in town. We have 24,500 buildings in Prescott and 29,000 lots. So the buildings, some of the buildings are on the lots. Each one of those is a potential location where we might have to do some dealing. So we have a large scale for the 2 officers to deal with. We have been doing pretty good with reaching out and responding to every complaint we get. So reactively, we've managed our staff really well. Becoming more proactive, more outreach, more officer-generated violations, if we find them, may take additional resources. That can include anything from additional staffing to additional material, or even in a situation of volunteers to help us with social media outreach. So just something to keep in mind. We consider that a future challenge. We're going to keep an eye on it. When we start moving forward with the ideas that come from you and the ideas that we're generating ourselves, we may be back to you to talk about those challenges.
Councilmember Rusing.
Thank you. George, I have a question about what happens when a property becomes condemned. Do we ever tear anything down and clean it up, or does it just stay condemned forever until the vagrants accidentally set it afire? I mean, what happens?
We have a very well-established process that we're going to get into in the next piece of this presentation. Ryan will be talking about that with the building section, because primarily condemnation is of a building, not of a property.
All right, thank you.
Councilwoman Cantelmi.
Thank you, Mayor. I think I'm going to wait for this next one because this is something that has been, as you know, since 2014, been a problem for me. And these are actually some pictures that I have supplied. And the middle property I actually purchased there. So I wanted to find out, as we go through this, how does a property get to that point if we have a code compliance officer out looking, 1 block from the city. So I want to find out not only how does it get to that point, but what is the long-term accountability to that, and how can we make sure that that doesn't happen? So it's not about weeds for me, it's about severe blight. And I do want to have you define what the Code Compliance Department's definition of blight is. Thank you.
Very good. Thank you for setting up the next couple of slides. One of the things that we've dealt with in the past are questions of blight. Is it or isn't it blight? And is it something that can be preempted? In some cases, we can preempt, and we talked earlier specifically about the fact that right now we're primarily reactive because of the staffing we have. So when we get complaint calls, we go out to that call and we look around it for any other violations. We don't generally do a geographic area inspection. That is an opportunity that we can certainly attempt to implement. It's going to put a little bit of a strain on us to do so, but that is something that may result in more complaints that are fixable. For instance, the one in the middle we've identified as property maintenance. That is not a blight situation. That's a simple code violation. It gets handled through a normal process. We send them a letter, clean up your stuff. You don't clean up your stuff, we send them to now a hearing officer who can impose fines on them. Blight typically involves buildings, and it's a larger area. So I will talk about the definition that's generally accepted in just a moment. But we are open to ideas, and we're open to focus input from you. If we need to spend more time looking for these situations, we can do that, but we may have to spend less time doing other code enforcement related things. Just something to keep in mind. This is based on HUD definitions and a number of other municipalities' definitions for what blight is. Generally, it's empty buildings. They're abandoned. Most of them are not maintained. The vegetation on the property is overgrown. Because it is overgrown and the buildings are obviously abandoned, you have a crime issue that comes with it. You have broken windows. In planning, there's a broken window theory that basically says if you can fix up the broken windows on property or board up the property that's damaged, you actually reduce the probability that nearby properties will also fall into that same level of decay. And fixing them has the same effect, but even better. It will encourage nearby property owners to bring their properties up. Lack of maintenance becomes dilapidated. Now we're talking about a building code issue along with simple appearance issues. And the vacant buildings do lead to an increase in crime. It's been proven nationwide that if you have a situation that expands out and takes multiple buildings into a blighted condition, you're going to see a crime issue in that area. We address blight in several different ways. We address the buildings themselves. So if we're out and about and we see something and it gets an identification of a code violation, it may go to the building department for follow-up. It may go to our neighborhood code compliance officers for follow-up depending on circumstances. It may go to both depending on circumstances. Again, with the hearing officer process, we can address them faster than we can now. We have a number of them that are in various stages of enforcement. I think Ryan will talk a little bit about a couple of those. I think he's got some numbers on a couple of those that are taking forever because of the court process or because of the notification process. As to the last part of your question about can we take them down, he will talk about that process as well, but City Council is involved in that process. So when we talk about that, we will make sure that you understand what your role is in getting to that point where we demolish a building. One of the things that I mentioned earlier was CDBG and the potential use of CDBG funds, sorry, I keep spitting in the microphone, potential use of CDBG funds in order to benefit some city projects in areas that may need extra help. They can also be used specifically to help individuals. And right now our CDBG budget has a minor home repair category, which we use to actually help individual people. So someone comes to us and says, I'm in violation. I don't have the money to fix my front porch. If it falls within the criteria that we need to follow for HUD requirements, the low to moderate income, LMI is the term we use. You'll hear that a lot when you talk to us. We can actually help you with CDBG funding to fix whatever's causing your blighted situation or your code violation situation. It was an experimental program that's expanding. We're expecting each year with CDBG, the Citizens Advisory Committee that helps us determine what goes into a CDBG budget will make that number larger and perhaps more a regular feature so that we can help individuals. Often a property owner simply doesn't have the money to fix their property. And we have several options in that case. We can help them fix their property, or we can make it harder for them by charging them fines. And ultimately, we may create a situation where someone is out of a home that they've lived in all their lives. We have three different categories of CDBG funding that can be spent. It has to fall into one of those three. Generally speaking, the top category, low to moderate income persons, are the top priority. That's the one that's most easily identified as fundable through the CDBG program. The second one, though, is slum and blight, and one of the things that we look at in that area is it an individual blighted situation or is it a blighted neighborhood? If it's a blighted neighborhood, HUD funding is far easier to accomplish than if it's an individual home, where we would handle it through perhaps the standard processes. Even if we use the elimination of slums and blight category, we still have to accomplish the LMI requirement. Except there is a 30% annual amount that can be spent outside of that. So 30% of our allocation could be spent in an area that isn't income qualified as low to moderate, or isn't an individual property owner who qualifies as low to moderate. 30% of our annual allocation is about $69,000. So that doesn't go very far if you're talking about blighted situations where repair of homes, repair of buildings is involved. A lot of money gets spent on repair of properties when you come to building permit processes, when you come to designers, hiring contractors, things that are required by other agencies. That's something that we've become very cognizant of and we want to work towards fixing. One of the things that we could do is acquire and demolish buildings using this funds. But again, if it's not in an LMI designated area, you can only spend your 30% of your income or 30% of your allocation on that acquisition. Again, $69,000 won't buy very much property, even if it's dilapidated. Hang on, let me back up one more. One of the things that we've looked at is providing a financial assistance to property owners to get rid of properties that have been cited, that have followed through all of our processes, and we've now ordered them to demolish their building. We can help them pay for that through CDBG, but again, it comes out of that same 30% unless it's in an LMI neighborhood. And we only have one geographic area that is geographically qualified. Otherwise, you have to individually qualify property owners. With that, I will take any questions you have about this that you haven't asked already, since some of you are terribly shy and haven't asked questions. And if you have no questions, we'll move on to the next part. And Ryan will present to you the building code side of compliance.
Councilwoman Cantelmi.
George, having served on the block grant committee and being very active in this when I was on the block grant committee, can you go back about 3 slides to the 2 houses up on the side of that one right there, the very first? I sent those people, they came to me about the block grant money. I sent those people down to you. What was the reason they did not qualify for that block grant money because of that failing retention wall?
That failing retention wall is in the city right of way. It's ours. So that's part of the problem.
Okay.
Thank you for bringing that out in the public.
Then why hasn't that been taken care of?
One of the problems we run into with any use of CDBG money is, again, you have to qualify as low to moderate income.
Right.
For us to individually qualify someone, they have to provide us with bank records and pay stubs and a lot of reporting information I wouldn't give you if you ask. I am the government. I'm here to ask about your income. So that's one of the problems we run into. The fact that they may need help doesn't mean that they're willing to give the information out that's necessary in order to qualify for that help. And that is one of the problems we see a lot. Even the minor home repair program, you have to prove that you qualify income-wise in order to get that funding, and that is a challenge.
Well, have things changed on the block grant committee since I've been off of it for a few years? Are we now allocating at least a third, and a third of that money to what the HUD guidelines have laid out? Because when I was on, 100% of that money went to charities. And if you remember correctly, I tried to advocate for that money to go towards what it was initially intended for, which was blight. And some of the neighborhoods and some of these structures that should be condemned, like the one on the far right. You can't live in that house. So what does happen? And if we go after those people in the court, can we, and this is probably a question for Joe, can we remove that dangerous piece of property and then file a lien on the property legally to recuperate the money that we have spent to eradicate a project like that, a home that exists like that?
We do talk a little bit about that in the next section that Ryan's going to talk to you about, so that may be appropriate, but certainly Joe can answer the lien question because it will come up.
Thank you.
Councilmember Rusing.
I think this has been a wonderful leap forward to have a hearing officer to take the burden off of the courts. I know that our courtrooms are actually overfilling and double booked. Is there any way we could have the hearings here in the council chambers to take the burden off of the courts?
That is the intention, to use existing city facilities to hold these hearings. Yeah.
And that has been the
Great.
intent all along, is not to have to go to the courthouse for those hearing officer actions.
Well, I'll weigh in a little bit on the previous areas. I think we want to make sure that our code enforcement and compliance officers are being proactive and not totally focused on complaint response. So I think some of the proposals here are encouraging, that not only are you identifying maybe geographical areas that you're responding to, but then maybe doing a survey in that area so you can identify similar needs without running all over the place responding to individual concerns. I think as we continue to upgrade our city website, maybe having an opportunity for people who are concerned about issues, being able to connect with maybe a particular city code so they know what is the standard for weeds. Maybe they can answer their own complaint without having to engage the officers themselves. That when we looked at how many complaints were received and how many turned out to be legitimate, we might be able to eliminate some of those without any involvement in the members of the team. I know that I saw a number of political signs that were in the no political sign area. They weren't actively looking at that. I saw a number of political signs that were in city right away. I even had a couple of people on my team put a sign in there, and I had to go out and pick it up myself.
Yeah.
But I never saw any of the other ones being removed as they should have been, or at least contacted and said, hey, candidate X, this sign can't be placed here. I see a lot of these flag and banner signs that are in city right-of-way that after a few storms in here are tattered and distractive to drivers. Those are glaringly obvious. I also see a lot of the sandwich board signs that are outside of the Preservation Commission downtown area where they're allowed. And that's all it takes is one business to say, put theirs out, and the next one next door says, well, if they can do that, I'm going to do it too. And before you know it, you get another big wind and you got these things in the gutters and in the street. So I just think there's a lot of opportunity to just open up your eyes and let's try to enforce these codes as the city charter indicates that we're committed to do so. So those are just a few suggestions that I have.
Thank you.
Me?
Thank you, Mayor. At the risk of getting in the weeds, what is the standard for weeds?
It's 12. It's 12 inches.
12 inches, you said?
Yep.
Okay.
So if you want to grow your weeds to 11 inches and keep them trimmed like a gentleman 2 blocks away from me who planted yardsticks in his yard so that he knew literally there were 20 of them. Yeah.
That's fantastic. Great. Yep. Thank you.
Yeah, I just want to, we only have about 20 minutes before the voting meeting, and Mr. Green needs to do his portion of the presentation.
You still want to make a comment, Councilmember Rusing? Okay.
I'm nervous, so I'll go fast.
Thank you, Ryan.
And to address Mr. Worley's complaint, this mic is just right. Good afternoon, Mayor and Council. For those of you who have not met me, my name is Ryan Green. I'm the building official for the City of Prescott. Just recently celebrated my 2-year anniversary here, so longest I've ever been in a job. I'm excited about that. All right, so today we're going to jump in and talk about the building code compliance part of things. Now, you'll notice throughout this presentation, there's going to be a lot of parallels between code compliance and building compliance. We do that legitimately. We pride ourselves in community development as being a one-stop shop, and that's not only for permits, that's also for code violations as well. So I know that George and myself, along with Wendy and Tander and Mike and Chelsea, we all work very closely together to try to keep our processes as consistent as we can. So if you get a code violation, and then a building violation, it looks very similar opposed to completely two dueling processes. So Chelsea said the button down. There we go. Okay, so as far as community development department goes, we have building safety, neighborhood services, historic preservation, and planning and zoning. Building and safety is charged with building violations, building compliance cases, as well as intaking all new construction permits, reviewing the plans that are associated with those permits, and also issuing out those permits and performing inspections. Just to kind of put it in relevance, currently as far as field work goes, we do on average over 7,000 new construction inspections a year. We have 3 building inspectors. 2 of them are directly funded by the building department, and 1 of them is funded by Public Works to handle the residential grading and drainage side of things. So we have 3 inspectors, including myself, that they're not here today because they're out doing inspections, but we run about 17 to 20 inspections a day between the 3 of us. So we're busy. So a few of the topics that we're going to go over, we're going to talk about parameters and purpose, a little bit of the difference between code and building. We're going to talk about the most common violations we see on the building compliance side of things. Then we're going to move into compliance strategies, go over our procedures, talk about some of the codes and ordinances that have been adopted to allow us the authority to issue violations, and then wrap it up with opportunities and challenges. So jumping in here, our focus from the building division is 100% on structures, while code compliance focuses more on property. When we talk development, we talk flat work and vertical work. Flat work being our grading and drainage and landscapes and weeds and grass, and then our vertical portions of construction, which would be our structures. That's pretty much how the organization is laid out. Code compliance handles the property side of things, while the building division handles vertical structures. First and foremost, our main responsibility and our main goal above anything else is protecting the health and life safety of our patrons within these buildings. Good metrics that I use is every building that I walk through, I look at it in the vein as if I wanted my kids walking through as well. And that usually gives me a pretty good variable to go off of. And then we also manage and require permit issue for all construction projects. I just kind of wanted to hit that again, that we do both. We do building compliance as well as all new building construction and permits that are issued in town. Sorry. Where am I? Oh. It's not working. Do what? Everything was going so good. There we go. There we go. Okay, let me get regrouped here. Okay, so building compliance violations. Up on the screen, you will see all of our most common types of violations. The number next to them is how many cases we have had in the last 3 years. First and foremost, and our most common violation is working without a permit. I'm hoping nobody here has done any work without a permit. Okay. Most of the time when we see these, we get compliance very quickly. And the reason being is there's normally a licensed contractor that is doing the work without a permit. And working without a permit could cause you to lose your license from the state of the Registrar of Contractors. So oftentimes, if we go out and post a violation that you're working without a permit, those are remedied within a couple of days. This number isn't quite accurate just because a lot of times they are so fast. For example, I had one last week. I went out, posted the stop work order. By the time I got back to the office to put it into our system, said contractor had already showed up, gotten his permit, gotten the permit issued, and was calling in for inspections. So most of the time we record them, but when they happen that quickly, it's just, yep, we have a permit, we have our compliance, everybody's safe, let's move on. Structural failures, this would be loss of structural integrity, broken beams, broken columns, falling floors, things of that nature. Unsanitary conditions, poor maintenance of living conditions. The most common type is broken sewer line, flooded the basement, and we need to get that fixed. Unsafe conditions, any condition that poses an imminent threat to health or life safety. This will prove important later in the presentation because that unsafe condition is what will lead to an unsafe to occupy, or rather yet condemned. And then our last one is just overall dilapidation. This is when a structure's fallen into decay or disrepair where the ends they aren't worth the means, meaning I have a house that's appraised for $150,000. We've identified $175,000 worth of building remediations. At that point, the best play is to just get rid of the building and start over. We have any questions right now? Okay, I will move on. All right, compliance strategies. We have 4 main types of compliance strategies. 3 of them, the pictures off to the left of the screen, are our exact violation orders. So if you see those taped on anybody's house as you're driving around, this is what they mean. I just want to let everybody know that we do tape our violations to the door. We do not nail them. Just because every now and then somebody might have a $30,000 English Castlewood door that a 16 penny nail doesn't look too good through. So first off, we have our stop work order. This is administered by the building official or an appointed qualified individual. So essentially, myself or my staff will go out and post the stop work order. And I'd like to hit here that as far as enforcement goes, from a stop work order standpoint, if we issue that stop work order and all work stops, they're considered in compliance. We're waiting for them to come back and get a permit. We're not necessarily going to keep going back and going back and going back and going back unless that stop work order was issued because some of the work going on site is a violation, which most of the times that is what we find. We're going out because we've received a complaint that somebody's building a deck without a permit. We go out, we see the deck, yep, you need to come in and get a permit. And while you're at it, you should probably go ahead and reframe those stairs because they're just not looking too good. So normally stop work orders will come with also a notice of violation. Our notice of violation is also administered by the building official or an appointed qualified individual. This is the notice that we use for things in regards to, we have a post that's cracked in your front porch, not necessarily a life safety issue, but your porch is falling and we need to get this addressed rather quickly. On those notice of violations, we will put the code sections that are being violated, and then at the bottom we will also put down how many days somebody needs to contact the building department. And then once that contact is made, we're considered in compliance for now, and then we continue to work that case with that applicant to try and get compliance. We also have an unsafe to occupy placard, which is also known as a condemnation placard. I would like to say here that condemning a home does not necessarily mean it will be demolished. That is not what the definition of condemned is, and it isn't in our city code either. The definition of a condemned structure is it's simply unsafe to occupy. So when we have situations like this, we will respond. It's administered by the building official. We will placard the home, require everybody to evacuate immediately, and then after that, we will require the owner to board up the structure to make sure that it is made safe. And then the fourth one that we have is it is a right to demolish, and it does require city council approval, which we'll go over here in just a second. So our compliance procedure looks very similar to that of code compliances. We receive a complaint from a reaction or a reactive nature. A site inspection is performed. Code case is generated, notice of violation is issued, or an unsafe to occupy or a stop work order, what have you. After that's issued, we'll make contact with the owner. We'll establish a timeline in which this needs done, and then we'll have weekly occurring inspections to track progress until compliance is achieved, or as George mentioned in his presentation, we're just not getting contact with the owners. We haven't had any communication with the owners. We will issue a 90-day notice of demolition.
Councilwoman Cantelmi.
Thank you, Mayor. Ryan, George, have we ever done that? Have we actually done that in the city of Prescott?
In the 2 years that I have been here, we have not. And to my knowledge, speaking with the rest of my staff, that has not happened within 12 to 15 years. I will say that we have a couple cases that are going on right now where the notice has been issued. So possibly could have one in about 67 days.
Okay, thank you.
Okay.
Councilman Shishka.
Thanks, Mayor. Just real quick, Ryan, I'd like to speak to you a little bit after the meeting, so I'll ask a question then, if you could just hang around for a little bit.
Absolutely. So jumping into some of the codes that have been adopted by the city of Prescott that we go off of, we have adopted the 2018 International Building and Residential Code. They handle all new construction. Our 2018 International Existing Building Code regulates existing and historic structures. This is a very good code. It's very comprehensive of not only how to remediate existing buildings, but how to remediate buildings that have a historical factor. We have quite a few of those in Prescott. So that code has been just very good to work with. It's easy for the architects, designers, and owners as well to read and follow. So that's a very good code. Our Prescott City Code, Section 341, does authorize the building official to examine every building or structure structure, as well as 753 in the code enforcement section authorizes the building official to examine exterior surfaces and foundation walls. I would like to add that the way our city code reads now is that if the building official has tried to work through a code case and has not gotten the compliance that we are seeking, we are allowed to issue a 90-day notice, and we are allowed to issue that 90-day notice based upon if that structure is a public nuisance. So, for example, we have a structure that has been placarded as unsafe to occupy. We have a few of those in town right now. We request that they be boarded up. Some of them remain boarded up. I have some folks that's their retirement plan when they retire from Phoenix, is to come up and rehabilitate this condemned structure. They come up yearly, they make sure the house remains boarded up, and it is not a public nuisance. There's not mice that are running in there. There's not transient activity, no record of crime. And then on the other side of it, we have structures where we placard them as unsafe to occupy. We have them placarded up, and within a couple of weeks, the boards come down, windows get broken, people are moving in, the police are out multiple times during a night event or something like that. At that point, that home would be considered a public nuisance. We have quite a few of those, I would say probably 3 or 4, that are getting ready to move to the next step for that very reason. Opportunities and challenges. I'm not going to go over the hearing officer process too much. I feel like George did a great job of really explaining the benefit to that. And then mirroring code compliance, just more emphasis on education versus enforcement. I'm typically the one that goes and inspects these sites just because I feel like it's kind of my duty, just because I want to give our applicants and owners in town the best experience, and I want to be able to look at and evaluate a building as well as I can. 90% of the time, when I let somebody know that there's a code violation in the building nature on their property, they didn't even know it. So just finding more avenues for education, home shows, even just walking the downtown square, letting people know of some of these common defects and how to avoid them within your home. The minor home repair program, I've had the privilege of getting to be involved in that over the last year. We have helped numerous people, and I've showed up on sites that we have been able to offer a service and provided this very nice experience that if it would have been the other way around, it would have ended in a violation. And then more collaboration with neighborhood services. As they've mentioned, we've recently come all under the umbrella of ComDev. So being able to have them as a close working partner and collaborate back and forth is very helpful. Oftentimes, code compliance cases start because of weeds or something like that, and Miss Wendy will call me and say, hey, I was out there looking at the weeds and the front porch is looking like it's about to fall. Will you go take a look? So we collaborate that way. Challenges. Building violation repairs are often costly. I know we're running short on time, but I just kind of wanted to hit on this. A lot of times with code compliance cases, for example, when we're talking about weeds or vegetation, a lot of times those are relatively inexpensive costs. You can go rent a lawnmower, rent a weed eater, and bring your lot back into compliance. I recently had a building violation a couple months ago that involved the 30-inch busted beam that was holding up the second floor. The whole second floor was falling. We had some imminent life safety threats. I met with the owners and began explaining to them what needed to happen. Just right out the gate, it was going to require $10,000 to an engineer to evaluate what we needed to do. It was going to cost another $15,000 for temporary bracing. The beam itself was $5,000 by the end of it. Even before we got a permit issued, we were in over $100,000. A lot of times, some of these homes that we see that are in disrepair or dilapidating often are housing folks that have some financial constraints. So it can be a little more difficult on the building side trying to maintain compliance because there's some heavy costs in there. On top of, in this area, we are experiencing some serious material shortages as well as some labor shortages as well. So we're up against it. Our current staffing requires building compliance to be a dual role. Like I mentioned, the building inspectors are probably just now wrapping up their route for the day. That leaves us about another hour and a half to work on code compliance. So it's straining with the dual role. And then lastly, the public misconception of building compliance. When I walk onto somebody's home, they automatically think we're going to tear it down. And that's not our intention. Our intention is to gain compliance and beautify our old buildings, because in my opinion, that's what makes Prescott is our old historic downtown feel. And with that, if we have any questions, I'm more than happy to answer them.
Thank you, Ryan. Council Member Rusing.
Thank you. I just wanted to make the comment that if we don't enforce our codes, it's bad for businesses, it's bad for our neighborhoods, and it's bad for the community in general. So I'm glad that we had this presentation, and moving forward, we can start improving the quality of life for our community in the long term. Thank you.
Absolutely. And just like George mentioned, any fresh ideas or any concerns or thoughts about how we could make this process better, my door is always open.
Thanks again, Ryan. I think you're really doing a great job over there, and I think the whole responsibility in your area has been visibly and measurably improved. So we're looking for continued success.
Thank you, Mayor.
We've got about 5 minutes here before our next voting session starts, so we'll take a very brief bio break, and we'll be back right about 3 or maybe a couple of minutes after. Thank you.